That was right after the Paris Agreement. The U.S. had just gotten China on board to do renewable energy development, and then Trump came in, pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. We missed that opportunity to develop tons of different alternative energies that then China and to a lesser extent other countries took on, but mostly China, and used that boom.
I think that was something that in the 4 years where the Trump presidency pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement was other countries saw that as an opening and the opportunity to double down on their own investments, their own policies, knowing that a major economic power was deciding to sort of boycott things effectively.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Devi Gopalan. If they took a roll call at COP29, this is what it would have sounded like. US President Joe Biden, absent. China's leader Xi Jinping, not here. And Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, not present. And why is this so notable for the world's biggest climate conference? Well, these are the leaders of the world's top 3 carbon emitters. On the other hand, major oil-producing countries sent some of the largest delegations, while the COP host, Azerbaijan's President Ilham Aliyev, reiterated his belief that oil and natural resources are the gift of God. Oh, and incidentally, it has been the hottest year on record so far. So, where does that leave COP29? And is it time to rethink COP and the entire model of global climate action? For this conversation, we are joined by Linh, the chair of Climate Action Network Australia, who's speaking to us from COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, and Nate Maynard, an environmental consultant based in London. Thank you both so much for joining the program. I will start with you, Linh. How many COPs have you attended?
This is my least favorite question, which is to say I have been to an extremely large number of COPs, both as a youth delegate, a journalist and an advocate. But currently I'm here with the Waddell Fellowship and as chair of Climate Action Network Australia. To a degree, part of the reason why it almost doesn't matter how many COPs I've been to is, just as you sort of initially said, should we rethink what this framework looks like? The framework and the process has changed quite considerably over the last 10, 15 odd years. As well, since effectively the really big Copenhagen summit in 2009, the obviously much more successful meeting in 2015 in Paris as well. So there have been many ebbs and flows as to what the COPs look like.
And Nate, how many COPs have you been to?
I've been to 3. I can count it on one hand. I went to Paris the first time, and that gave me maybe a false sense of success. Then I went to Poland, where they had a big piece of coal right in the blue zone negotiating area. And then most recently I was in COP28 in Dubai, and we talked about it last year, so happy to be back again.
And throughout the program, we'll be going through some of what has been or has not been achieved in those various COPs you both mentioned. But as far as this COP goes, Linh, is this good COP or bad COP, and why?
Yeah, what a great question. I think one of the things to maybe just zoom a little bit out is that I often think of COPs as, are we at an implementation meeting or are we at a decision-making meeting? So decision-making meetings would be the ones that lots of people have heard around. So, for example, the process to agree the Paris Agreement at COP21 in 2015, or right after COVID in Glasgow at COP26, the Glasgow Climate Pact. And that's really when 198 odd countries around the world gather together to try to reach some sort of consensus around decisions and things that they agree to universally when it comes to climate change. That is not really the case at this COP. This is an implementation COP. So an implementation COP, in many ways, is a little bit more boring than other events. An implementation COP definitely can be misunderstood as being a bit of a talk fest, but it's really actually about figuring out, well, if we've set these lofty goals and ambitions, how do we actually drill that down into how will we get there, how will we achieve that, and what would that ultimately look like as well? So it's really around how do we turn these promises that we have into practice.
And speaking of those goals and ambitions, Nate, one of the key issues at this year's COP are financing energy transition and climate adaptation in developing countries. Can you explain what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. So globally, the largest, richest countries, for the most part, have been the ones who've contributed to climate change. The U.S. and Europe broadly, including Russia, are the largest historical emitters. And even though China is the largest emitter today, they started from kind of a much lower economic place during industrialization. So a big conversation that was really had last year at COP28 is continuing this one is how do higher income countries, the ones who've benefited the most from industrialization with fossil fuels, how do they pay lower income countries to adapt to climate change? So that means, preparing for higher storm surges. That means securing water supplies. That means ensuring populations can survive higher temperatures. And then how can they mitigate it?
Right. And agenda aside, Lynn, what would you say is the biggest issue right now that needs immediate action and commitment?
The biggest issue right now is definitely climate finance, and that's both climate finance to drive some of these mitigation efforts. So that's everything from what Nate just talked about. What are the renewable energy projects that we're getting up? How do we ensure that this is a just transition, whether that's in a developed economy like Australia or, emerging economies as well. But climate adaptation funding is also really critical at the moment. The climate finance goal that we have of $100 billion is currently not yet really being met by private or public sectors. And this is something that is required because climate impacts are being felt in all parts of the world. And it's impacting not just on people's lives, but of course also their livelihoods as well.
All right, I'm going to move on to take a bigger picture look at what is happening in our atmosphere. So let's take a look at emission levels over the past 3 decades. And these flags indicate the host countries of each year's COP. And as you can see, despite the landmark 2015 Paris Agreement to reduce carbon emission by 45% by 2030, there's been a very steady rise in the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. So that leads me to ask, the world's biggest emitters are notably absent. And you look at that chart, and it feels like none of the initiatives and commitments have really become tangible and had some kind of an impact. So, how effective is COP, Lynn, on really getting action and seeing that implemented?
It's a sort of double-edged sword. This is the best process and framework that we have where every single country in the world actually does come together, tries to facilitate and negotiate to shared outcomes. So I think I'm always really conscious with no matter how bad a COP is, to not throw the baby out with the bathwater and considering what else it is that we could do. Even though we haven't yet hit the targets that we set around green climate finance, the $100 billion target, we have seen $700 million pledged and delivered into vulnerable countries and communities. And had it not been for this process, where would have that $700 million come from? Certainly no one national government. So I think there's still a lot of room and reason, I think, for hope as to why these processes are important.
So Nate, you were there at last year's COP, and we spoke to you when you were in, I believe, Dubai, right? You were there when some of those new commitments were being made and new pledges and new plans. Having been there and a year later, taking stock of that, how effective do you think COP is?
I think it can be difficult to judge the impact of COP, just 1 year later. I will say it's pretty remarkable looking at that graph, what we don't see. And that's that, today, 90% of global GDP is under a net zero target. We have solar being unsubsidized, being the cheapest form of electricity in the world. So while on paper it may not look like we're doing much to draw down global CO2, we are finally getting there economically and getting those foundations in place. Just to contrast, COP21, there was 40,000 attendees. We barely had economic solar. China was only just starting its kind of renewable energy development push. Now, COP28, we have more than 100,000 delegates attending. We have really cheap renewables for the first time. We have global EV fleets, electric vehicle fleets, and options to choose from. I would say that in terms of the tools available to us, we've made a ton of progress. In that year since Dubai, well, I think we've just seen a lot of delays from, geopolitical challenges, and that doesn't mean that it's going to stop progress, but I don't think that we can necessarily look in 1 year and see a lot. So we'll have to, ask me in 2 or 3 years what I think about COP28.
But I think even if you zoom out as a result of that and you look at what didn't exist before the Paris Agreement, this notion that we should even be striving to keep warming to 1.5 degrees, the fact that now major institutions, whether it's been the World Bank, the international sort of like energy institutions, coming out and saying that yes, 1.5 degrees is something that we should be aiming for. 10 years ago, that was completely unthinkable. Similar to corporations having net zero targets, and now under different sort of economic regimes and political systems, having financial disclosures for their climate assets, but also their nature-based assets as well. So this is something that, again, 10 years ago didn't exist and predominantly has come out of the COP processes.
Right, and it's nice to hear that there is hope and there is optimism. But the actual venue where it is taking place has come under a lot of spotlight, and perhaps not the kind of spotlight it wanted. Host country Azerbaijan came under fire from climate activist Greta Thunberg. She accused the government of greenwashing its human rights record by hosting the event. Take a listen.
Today we are at the first day of COP29, which is taking place in Baku in Azerbaijan. We are standing here outside the Azerbaijani embassy in Tbilisi in Georgia. It is completely unacceptable that a country like Azerbaijan that is continuously cracking down on civil society, repressing the population, especially those who are acting as watchdog roles in Azerbaijan, trying to express their basic human rights, while also committing ethnic cleansing against Armenians, an economy that's completely dependent on fossil fuels and is planning to expand the production and exports. That a country like that gets to host the climate meeting and therefore gains legitimacy from the international community and is given a pass to continue committing these crimes.
Now, there are always protests outside of these COP events, but also this time it's also particularly intensified because Azerbaijan is a petrostate. So, Linh, does this cast a shadow on the event?
Definitely. It casts a shadow on the event. And I think any country that wants to host a COP and thinks that it will immediately result in them being celebrated as a green climate champion is a little bit delusional. If anything, I think before this COP, there were many people who didn't know exactly where Azerbaijan was, what exactly Azerbaijan's human rights records were. And of course, the fact that Azerbaijan is the source of oils that the Nobel brothers, who later went on to, invent and create the Nobel Peace Prize, that's where a large source of their wealth came from. So I think in hosting in a country like this, whilst there are many that would prefer that people weren't secretly trying to use hosting the COP to, construct other oil and gas deals, it really has shone a spotlight on this country and tried to hold it to account. When the international community shows up somewhere, I think a different set of standards would apply. And there's a tension between, I guess, the forms of the civil protests and social, civil society engagement that's possible might not exist in Azerbaijan normally, but is occurring whilst we are here within the UN confines. The last thing that I'll maybe point out on that that's sort of interesting is that, unfortunately, with where the world is at on the transition to a renewable energy economy, everyone is a petrostate. It just depends on how we want to define what is a petrostate. If you're not in the position of producing oil and gas yourself, you're certainly importing it in order to fuel your economy right now. I say that as someone who comes from Australia, where we have put in a bid to host COP in 2026. We're one of the biggest fossil fuel exporters in the world, but people don't describe Australia as a petrostate in quite the same way because, we have a slightly different public image when it comes to geopolitics. So it's a bit of, again, like all things at COP, a real double-edged sword.
Right. And, speaking of petrostates, there are those that are clearly defined as petrostates. And one of those is Dubai, where the last COP was held, Nate. But that was also the first time that countries agreed to transition away from fossil fuels and really put some muscle into towards green energy. So have you seen the progress in that, or do you feel that momentum is still there?
I just want to add, as a fellow citizen of a petrostate, the United States, the world's now largest fossil fuel producer, that progress is still there. And just because the country is a petrostate doesn't mean that the scrutiny of COP can't help it. The UAE is really interesting. Besides, their petrochemical production is lower than it has been in the past. I think, some of the largest economic growth there is from property development. They also have a state-run renewable energy company called Masdar. So, for better or worse, they were also organizing renewable energy deals there. that momentum will continue kind of regardless of the pressure of COP, because we now have such strong economic forces around solar and wind, but also around batteries, electric vehicles, and the smart grid. We're not going to see that go away just because some countries might, change tact. So I think that this, and also to follow on what Lynn's saying, I think that this scrutiny of COP is good. I think that people kind of, go in waves of criticizing certain countries for their human rights records, their climate records. And, UAE, to their credit, really did take that on, and they went around the world trying to kind of push for a better agreement. Maybe there was fossil fuel, side deals on the side that they were organizing that we'd seen in some reports, but, they were really pushing for climate action. And let's see what happens with Azerbaijan. Poland, they had COP there. 80% coal use. Today, now it's 61%. So it's also possible that the scrutiny of COP and being there can cause some change later on down the road.
And we will be definitely talking a little bit more about that. But I want to go back to COP, where world leaders are negotiating how the climate burden should be shared financially at this year's meeting. And from this graph, we can see that the US and EU contributed nearly 50% of the total cumulative CO2 emissions since the first industrial revolution, while China, Russia, Japan, and India made up around 25%. Now, Lynn, the European Union is pushing for the donor base to be widened. Can you tell us what that's about?
Yes. So effectively, most climate finance historically comes from government institutions and is delivered through either bilaterally, so directly from one government to another government, or through initiatives such as like the World Bank and other multilateral development banks as well. And as you can see from that graph, there have been a number of countries who over the years have not felt the need to contribute or been able to contribute because it hasn't been proportionate to their contributions on an emissions front. And there has also been, particularly when the Trump presidency was last in place, certain countries choosing to really renege on some of their international commitments when it comes to climate finance. Effectively, what the European Union is asking for is other people to also help shoulder that burden. And we've already heard a little bit from Nate sharing some of the positives around the strong economic indicators and drivers that we have when it comes to the positive things that can come from climate investment. And partly that's why governments are asking for the private sector to also step up. Private sector, of course, has really different obligations because they're not using taxpayers' money. They're able to invest in things that might have a different risk profile. They might be able to move and transition money faster than what governments are able to do. And it, of course, I think importantly, also acknowledges the role that corporations have played in being able to most likely benefit economically from the use of fossil fuels as well.
Right, and those companies in sharing the burden that you're talking about benefiting not necessarily from the use, but from the production of fossil fuels, and very clearly are benefiting from that, are the oil and gas companies who also are creating the problem. And they've had bumper year, not just this year, but in recent years of profits. Nate, how much conversation is there in them also contributing to climate finance?
I think oil and gas companies see the inevitable down the path. I mean, they global awareness on climate change is stronger than it's ever been. If we think about, the next generation, the youth climate strikes, they started under the, not under, but adjacent to the previous Trump presidency. So we're going to see more and more pushback. They're going to have to contribute and think about diversifying. Here in the UK, the oil and gas industry is really interested in hydrogen networks because you can kind of reuse a lot of that same infrastructure and skill base. I've heard and met with a geothermal energy company that's trying to use previous drilling expertise to convert that over. But in terms of the financial responsibility, they're going to have to pay at some point. It just sort of depends on, whether it's on their terms or in the face of an extremely angry public.
And one of the things, if you look into a crystal ball and you're talking about the next generation, that really needs to be addressed is AI and the data centers and the whole energy guzzling ecosystem around it. Lynn, how much conversation is there about that? Is that being addressed?
It's on the fringe at the moment, and right now that doesn't actually get discussed within the official negotiations, but part of the, ballooning of the negotiations in terms of the number of people that come to COP now means that there are a number of people outside of the official negotiations having those conversations. So just last week, I was at an event where Google's head of sustainability was there talking about the measures that they have put in place in recognizing that data centers is one of the fastest growing, sources of emissions, and the role that AI has to play in that. And of course, looking at the positives of how could we be using AI and like what it can do, particularly with like data and like machine learning to actually improve what our climate models are and design our interventions to be much more specific and place-based. But it's certainly one of the big opportunities that exist for any government in the world at the moment, or a coalition of governments, to come together and decide what are some positive steps that we could take for proactive and preventative steps that we could take in this regard, given that this is an area that is currently uncharted territory, but we have a sense of what's coming up.
Now, Nate brought it up, but we're going to go further in this direction about what Washington's likely to do, as its incoming president, Donald Trump, has promised to pull out of international climate pacts and slash environmental regulations as soon as he's back in the White House. Here's what he said at the Republican National Convention in July.
Tonight, I make this pledge to the great people of America. I will end the devastating inflation crisis immediately, bring down interest rates, and lower the cost of energy. We will drill, baby, drill.
Saying that, Nate, the U.S. has had an oil boom under the Biden administration, as we said, with production hitting all-time highs, outstripping Russia, Saudi Arabia, and even other OPEC countries. So what's really at stake here?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny to watch that clip because the U.S. is the largest fossil fuel producer at this moment, and Joe Biden's administration did bring down inflation and through the Inflation Reduction Act and other means. So it's kind of strange to hear that quote there. We've also been here before, back in 2016, that was right after the Paris Agreement. The U.S. had just gotten China on board to do renewable energy development, and then Trump came in, pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. We missed that opportunity to develop tons of different alternative energies that then China and to a lesser extent other countries took on, but mostly China, and used that boom. So I would kind of expect us to be back there. And, really pulling out of the Paris Agreement as the U.S., I don't know if it's weird to use this term, but it feels a bit like virtue signaling, because look at who else is in the COP agreement at the moment. We have large petrostates like Australia, like Russia, like Saudi Arabia, who are all members to COP. So just because the U.S. produces a lot of fossil fuels doesn't mean that we necessarily have to pull out. It just puts us in a weaker position, and other countries that are at the negotiation table aren't going to take the U.S. as seriously because, well, we just jump in and out of this treaty every 4 years.
And I think it also limits the opportunities for American companies, whether based there or like headed up with American sort of staff, to have clear market signals on how they could be progressing the huge economic opportunity, the multi-trillion-dollar opportunity that is the transition to renewable energy. And I think that was something that in the 4 years where the Trump presidency pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement, was other countries saw that as an opening and the opportunity to double down on their own investments, their own policies, knowing that a major economic power was deciding to sort of boycott things effectively. Only this is the sort of space that everyone wants to be in at the moment when we look at the money that is coming in from the private sector, not necessarily towards climate finance through this COP process in particular, but just the investments that people are making, the companies that are choosing to shift and pivot into renewable energy as well. But part of what I found particularly amusing in that Trump clip, other than it being, of course, like quite horrific as well, was this notion that people's electricity prices have gone up because of the shift to renewable energy, as opposed to other interests and sort of like inflation issues. I don't think I've ever spoken to any homeowner or like renter who benefits from solar panels that they are upset that come summertime, often their electricity bill is a big fat zero. So yeah, quite a bit of misinformation there, but I think that's a whole different segment if we were to go through line by line.
One more thing to add as well, that the U.S. is not just the federal government. There are plenty of large economically relevant states in the U.S. that are still committed to climate change, regardless of what the federal government does. It's made up of, American companies, as Linh said, that have commitments to net zero targets. California is going to be requiring carbon disclosures on all businesses that operate in its state. So in some ways, that even might have more of an impact than what the federal U.S. government is doing. Obviously, it's going to hold us back, but it's not like the entire U.S. suddenly doesn't believe in climate change because of Donald Trump getting reelected.
All right, so let's bring it back to Taiwan now. While some key nations are absent or pulling out from COP, Taiwan is excluded from the United Nations and not party to its commitments. But it has sent non-governmental observers and has set up a COP war room in Taipei to monitor the latest developments from the environmental summit. Chiawei Chao is one of the experts at the war room, and he is the research director of Taiwan Climate Action Network, and he told us about what he calls under-the-table diplomacy and the challenges Taiwan faces.
For example, like last year, the Taiwan government set out a 10 million climate transformation fund with our 4 allies, like the Marshall Island and the other small island country. So this is a way they are showing that the Taiwan we are willing to contribute, willing to work with our ally to deal with those climate action. This year, the important issue is talking about the climate finance. But during the whole year, when we talk about climate policy in Taiwan, actually, there's no wild discussion about how to enhancing our climate finance to other developing countries, to our ally in Taiwan. Actually, the government don't have the social license, don't have the public support to enhancing the climate finance to the other countries. So I would say that's the blind spot we have right now. If we can have a whole of a society approach to get more coordination between the government's delegation and the NGOs, we can have a more clear Taiwan's climate story to the international climate community.
Nate, you were an environmental consultant in Taiwan and were here for many years, in fact. And you've spoken with the Taiwanese delegates at this COP. How effective would you say is this kind of, as they call it, unofficial climate diplomacy described?
I'd say it's one of Taiwan's kind of only options, so it's pretty effective. It's definitely changed over the years. So just last year at COP28, when I went to the Palau Pavilion, that was largely sponsored by Taiwan. So much so that sometimes I would meet another delegate, and they would say, "Oh, have you seen the Taiwan Pavilion?" But it was actually in Palau. So I think it can have mixed results. It kind of depends on the branding and the marketing story that Taiwan's telling around these engagements. Taiwan is a significant fossil fuel user as well, and a very large exporter of plastics, and use a tremendous amount of gas. And the net zero target might be kind of questionable. So it's kind of a mixed climate picture. But I think that the countries that Taiwan partners with are really receptive to working with Taiwan. Taiwan's done a lot of economic growth outside of the UN. They have a lot of good environmental protections, outside of this larger environmental community. And it's something that, smaller countries can kind of relate to. Is it going to turn the needle? Is everyone going to suddenly try and push for Taiwan to be welcome at COP? I don't know about that, but I think this is a really good engagement step that Taiwan should definitely continue doing, because they have a huge role in climate change, so they have a huge responsibility to help other countries adapt and mitigate.
We're running out of time here, but very quickly, in a couple of sentences each, Nate, what do you think will be the takeaway from this year's COP that we can build hope on?
I hope that the takeaway is that we're going to continue building climate resilience and climate action, regardless of, the presence of some delegations, whether they leave, whether certain large petro-states drop out of the treaty. I think that momentum is going to continue.
And for you, Linh?
For me, I think it's fundamentally that this process still really matters. For all of the flaws that it has, it's the only international multilateral process we have where not only governments get to participate, but so do civil society. And that means both like non-profit organizations, but also businesses as well. And it's a space where we can be assured that every year there will be incremental improvements and increases in what the outcomes are. I think what we're most in need of right now is radical incrementalism, though. So how can, if not at this COP, in future COPs, that really be engendered?
And with that, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Nate Maynard, environmental consultant based in London, and Linh, the chair of the Climate Action Network Australia, who's speaking to us from COP29 in Baku. And for our viewers everywhere, it has been good to have your company. If you've enjoyed today's episode or have anything you'd like to add to the dialogue, do join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.